The sun was shining brightly that day, reflecting a sense of joy and hope. For Clara and Robert, it was a day filled with anticipation. As they stepped into the doctor's office for a routine ultrasound, they had no idea that their lives were about to take an unimaginable turn. Clara, pregnant with what they had hoped would be a perfect bundle of joy, lay on the examination table. Her large belly, the result of a multiple pregnancy, made her feel both excited and anxious. She exchanged a look of nervousness with Robert, her husband, who held her hand tightly. The joy of expecting their first child was overshadowed by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. They had yet to find out whether they were expecting a boy or a girl. But one thing was for sure, they already loved the child deeply. As the months passed, Clara's belly grew at an alarming rate, causing both excitement and concern. Her friends and family were amazed by the rapid growth, and many joked that she might be carrying twins. However, the larger her stomach grew, the more concerned Clara became about the pressure she was feeling. With each passing day, the weight of carrying multiple children took a toll on her body. It was during a visit to Dr. Sandra, Clara's trusted obstetrician, that the first hint of something unusual occurred. Dr. Sandra, known for her warm smile and reassuring manner, had already performed a number of ultrasounds throughout Clara's pregnancy. This time, as the doctor prepared for another ultrasound scan, Clara couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and anxiety. Robert was beside her, holding her hand, both of them eager to see their child, or perhaps children, on the screen. Dr. Sandra smiled as she began to move the ultrasound probe gently over Clara's abdomen. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the machine and the occasional beeping of medical monitors. At first, everything seemed fine, but as Dr. Sandra continued to examine the scan, her expression shifted. A slight frown replaced the smile that had once been on her face. Her brow furrowed, and she began adjusting the settings on the machine, her eyes intently focused on the screen. "Is everything all right, doctor?" Clara asked, her voice filled with concern. Robert squeezed her hand tightly, his eyes fixed on Dr. Sandra, wondering why the doctor seemed so distracted. Dr. Sandra remained quiet for a moment, her fingers hovering over the ultrasound controls as she adjusted the settings. Finally, she whispered something softly to herself, her voice barely audible. Robert looked at her with confusion. "What's wrong, doctor? Is our baby okay?" The doctor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she muttered again, this time with more urgency. Clara and Robert exchanged anxious glances, both of them starting to feel a sense of unease. Clara's heart began to race as she desperately hoped for reassurance, but it wasn't coming. Dr. Sandra suddenly stood up from her seat, muttering under her breath. She left the room quickly, saying she would be back shortly. Clara looked at Robert, her face pale with fear, unable to make sense of what had just happened. Robert tried to calm her, but his own heart was pounding in his chest, filled with dread over what they had just witnessed. Minutes later, Dr. Sandra returned, but she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by several other doctors and nurses, all of whom gathered around the ultrasound screen, their faces filled with disbelief. Clara's worry only intensified as she saw the concerned expressions of the medical staff. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed, and Clara could feel the tension building up. "Oh my God, this can't be real," one of the nurses whispered, her voice trembling. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to Robert, who looked as if he might collapse. He had never seen the medical staff so shocked. Clara could barely hold herself together. "Please, tell me what's happening. What is going on with our baby?" she pleaded, her voice shaking. Dr. Sandra turned to them with a cautious smile, but there was something in her eyes that made Clara's blood run cold. "There's something we need to discuss," the doctor said softly. "I'm afraid one of your babies, it's not a baby at all." Clara and Robert were stunned. The world around them seemed to fall apart as the doctor's words sank in. Clara's head swam, and she could feel the room spinning. What did the doctor mean? How could this be possible? Robert could hardly comprehend what he was hearing, his mind racing with questions. "Not a baby?" Robert repeated, his voice hoarse. "What do you mean?" Dr. Sandra didn't offer an immediate answer. She simply nodded to the others in the room and gestured for them to leave. The doctors and nurses filed out quietly, leaving Clara and Robert alone with their thoughts. "Is this some kind of mistake?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Robert held her tightly, but even he wasn't sure what was happening anymore. Was this all just a misunderstanding? Clara felt overwhelmed with emotion. The excitement of expecting multiple children had been replaced by confusion and fear. The idea that something was terribly wrong was too much for her to bear. As they left the doctor's office that day, their minds were filled with thoughts of what the future might hold. The joy of becoming parents had been replaced with a heavy uncertainty. They had always dreamt of a large family, but the reality of having 10 children, one of whom was not a child at all, felt like an unthinkable burden. The journey ahead was sure to be challenging, but Clara and Robert knew that they had each other, and that together, they would face whatever came their way. The unknown loomed large, but their love for each other and for the children they were about to welcome would carry them through. As they drove home in silence, the weight of the day's news pressed heavily on their shoulders. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As Clara and Robert made their way back home from the doctor's office, the weight of the discovery hung heavily in the air. They couldn't shake the shock of the news that one of their babies was not actually a baby at all. What should have been a joyful occasion had turned into a nightmare. They had dreamed of raising a large family, and now, they were facing an unexpected challenge that neither of them had prepared for. The drive back to their modest home in Cedarbrook felt like an eternity. Clara stared out of the window, her mind racing with questions, doubts, and fears. What did this discovery mean for their family? How would they explain this to their friends and family? What if something was wrong with the other children? So many uncertainties loomed over them, clouding their once hopeful anticipation. When they finally arrived home, it felt as though the walls were closing in around them. They sat down on their couch in the small living room, the silence between them deafening. Clara looked at Robert, tears welling up in her eyes. "How are we going to do this?" "Robert," she whispered, her voice full of fear. "We wanted this family so badly. But now, what does this mean for our children?" Robert reached over and gently took her hand in his grip firm yet comforting. He could see the worry in her eyes, and it mirrored the uncertainty in his own heart. But he knew they had to stay strong, for the sake of their children, and for each other. "We'll get through this, Clara. We've always faced challenges before, and we'll face this one together. We have our faith, and with that, we'll make it through," he said, trying to offer her some comfort, even though he wasn't sure himself how they would navigate the road ahead. Despite the uncertainty, Clara felt a small sense of reassurance in Robert's words. He was always the optimist, the one who believed that with hard work and determination, anything was possible. But now, the challenges ahead seemed so much bigger, so much more overwhelming. The news of Clara's pregnancy spread quickly throughout Cedarbrook. The town, known for its close-knit community and small-town charm, was buzzing with excitement and curiosity. The news of a woman carrying 10 children was unheard of, and the locals were eager to offer their help in any way they could. Neighbors began to show up at Clara and Robert's door with bags of baby clothes, diapers, and even hand-me-down cribs. Some people even volunteered to help with the housework or offer rides to doctor appointments. At first, Clara and Robert were overwhelmed by the outpouring of generosity. They had always lived modestly in their small home, never expecting the kind of attention they were now receiving. But as the donations continued to pour in, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. It was as though the entire town had rallied around them, eager to help in whatever way they could. "I can't believe how much everyone is doing for us," Clara said one evening as she and Robert sorted through the piles of donations in their living room. "It's overwhelming, but in a good way. It's like the whole town is supporting us. I never expected anything like this." Robert smiled as he helped carry bags of baby clothes into the nursery they had begun to prepare for their growing family. "It's amazing, isn't it? This is what community is all about. We may not have much, but we've got each other, and we've got the support of people who care. I know we can do this." Despite the generosity of their neighbors, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in her heart. She was grateful for the help, of course, but it didn't erase the nagging worry that something wasn't right. The thought of the child who wasn't really a child, the one the doctors had called a fibroid tumor, haunted her every day. She couldn't stop wondering what this meant for her other children. Were they all truly healthy? Would they face any complications? Days turned into weeks, and the pressure of carrying 10 babies began to take its toll on Clara. Her once vibrant energy began to wane as the pregnancy progressed. The physical demands of carrying so many children were intense, and she found herself growing more and more fatigued. Her body felt heavy, and every movement was a struggle. The pain in her back and legs became unbearable at times, but she tried not to complain. After all, she had a responsibility to care for her children, and she didn't want to let anyone down, especially Robert. Robert, too, began to feel the weight of the situation. He had always been a hard worker, but now he found himself juggling his job at the local hardware store, caring for Clara, and preparing for the arrival of their 10 children. He wasn't sure how they would manage, but he remained determined to make it work. "We'll figure it out," he would often say, though deep down, he wasn't sure how. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that wore on them. It was the emotional strain of knowing that one of their children wasn't actually a child at all. They couldn't shake the fear that the fibroid might affect the rest of the pregnancy, or worse, that it could harm their healthy children. Despite their worries, Clara and Robert continued to prepare for the arrival of their children. They had turned their guest room into a large nursery, installing multiple cribs and baby furniture to accommodate the growing family. The room, though small, was filled with love and hope. They spent their evenings assembling cribs, hanging up clothes, and talking about the future, trying to find comfort in the preparations they were making. The town's support continued, with people checking in on them regularly and offering any help they could. The generosity of Cedarbrook filled Clara and Robert with a sense of gratitude they had never known before. Despite the unknowns that lay ahead, they felt stronger knowing that they weren't facing this challenge alone. As the days drew closer to the birth, Clara and Robert found themselves reflecting more and more on the journey ahead. The road would be difficult, filled with uncertainty and fear, but with each other and the support of their community, they felt a glimmer of hope. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they knew that together, they could face anything. The journey to parenthood was never supposed to be this complicated, but Clara and Robert were determined to face whatever challenges came their way, no matter how impossible it seemed. After all, they had each other, and that was enough to face the unknown. As the days turned into weeks, Clara and Robert anxiously awaited the arrival of their children. The months of preparation, the overwhelming support from the community in Cedarbrook, and the constant worry about the unknowns had taken a toll on both of them. Despite the love and help from their neighbors, the fear of what would come next never quite left their hearts. Clara's pregnancy had become more challenging as time went on. Her body, already exhausted from carrying 10 children, was showing signs of strain. She had spent sleepless nights, her mind racing with thoughts of the fibroid the doctors had discovered and whether it would harm their remaining children. The weight of it all, both physically and emotionally, was immense. Robert did his best to support her, taking time off work to care for her and help with the preparations at home. But he, too, was weighed down by the constant worry about their future. The day of Clara's delivery arrived sooner than expected. Robert held her hand tightly as they rushed to Cedarbrook General Hospital. The hospital, a small but reliable institution, was where both Clara and Robert had spent much of their lives. It was where they were married, and where they had received all their medical care. The familiar surroundings did little to ease their anxiety as Clara was admitted to the maternity ward. The staff at Cedarbrook General was familiar with Clara and Robert by now, having followed her pregnancy closely. The hospital had been an invaluable resource, with nurses and doctors offering support and guidance throughout the entire ordeal. But as the delivery approached, the sense of uncertainty grew even stronger. As the hours passed, Clara's contractions became more intense. She lay in the delivery room, her hand gripped tightly by Robert, who was by her side, trying to remain strong for her. The room was filled with the sounds of medical equipment, the low murmur of nurses in the hallway, and the occasional beeping of monitors that tracked the progress of Clara's labor. But all Clara could focus on was the excruciating pain that coursed through her body. She could feel her strength slipping away, but she held on, determined to bring her children into the world. Finally, after hours of labor, Clara was wheeled into the operating room for an emergency C-section. The room was filled with doctors and nurses, all moving quickly to prepare for the birth of the children. Robert was asked to wait outside, his heart pounding in his chest as he stood in the hallway, nervously pacing back and forth. His mind raced with thoughts of the unknown child, the fibroid, and what would happen next. Would they all be okay? Would their family be complete? As the surgery began, Clara was under anesthesia, her body still trembling from the pain. The doctors worked quickly, carefully removing the babies one by one. With each new cry, Robert could feel a sense of relief flood his chest. The sounds of babies crying filled the room, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. One after another, the children were born, 9 healthy babies in total. There were 5 girls and 4 boys. The staff worked swiftly, cleaning them up and placing them into incubators, where they would be monitored closely. But there was still one baby left, the one that had caused so much concern throughout the pregnancy. Robert's heart raced as he anxiously awaited the moment they would find out the truth. As the doctors continued their work, a sudden silence fell over the room. Robert could hear the doctors muttering to each other, and his stomach sank. He knew something was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, the final moment came. The doctor reached into Clara's womb and began to carefully remove the last child. Robert held his breath, unable to look away. The doctor's expression shifted from concentration to confusion. Robert's heart stopped. What was happening? Why wasn't there any crying? The doctor turned to him, a troubled look on their face. "We have a situation here, Mr. Robert," the doctor said, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" Robert asked, his voice filled with dread. The doctor paused, clearly unsure of how to explain. This isn't a child. It's a fibroid, a benign tumor. It seems to have developed inside Clara's womb alongside the baby's, which explains the pain she's been feeling." The doctor's voice was low and apologetic. Robert couldn't believe it. All this time, they had been carrying what they thought was a child, only to learn it was a fibroid. The news hit him like a ton of bricks. He felt a wave of disbelief, anger, and relief all at once. Relief that their children were healthy, but anger and sadness at the loss of what he had believed was one of their children. The doctors removed the fibroid carefully, and after ensuring that Clara was stable, they began to focus on the newborns. Clara woke up groggy and disoriented, but as soon as she opened her eyes, she heard the cries of her children. Robert was by her side, holding her hand tightly, his eyes filled with tears. "You did it, Clara," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You did it. We have our children." The room was filled with the sound of babies crying, a symphony of life. Clara smiled weakly, tears streaming down her face. "My babies," she whispered, her heart swelling with love. After several weeks of intensive care and monitoring, the babies were all finally ready to go home. Clara and Robert were overjoyed to bring their 9 healthy children back to their home in Cedarbrook. The town had rallied around them, offering more help than they could ever imagine. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers had come together to support this family in their time of need. The nursery, which had been prepared with so much love, was now filled with the sounds of the babies. The room was small, but it was theirs, their sanctuary. Clara and Robert worked tirelessly, but they were grateful for every moment, every laugh, and every cry. As they sat together in their modest home, surrounded by their children, Clara and Robert reflected on the journey they had been through. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and loss, but they had emerged stronger, with a family that was theirs to cherish. Life in Cedarbrook would never be the same for Clara and Robert. They had endured the unimaginable, but they had come out the other side stronger. Their love for each other and their children deeper than ever. Their story, though filled with hardship, was one of hope, faith, and the incredible power of love.